there's very little ploughing done already, and maybe what ploughing mightn't be any great advantage if it dries too quickly. So ploughing is going to be the slow end of that process. There's nothing you can do other than to have everything ready and ready to go, but it certainly is going to be a bottleneck, especially at the start in getting things moving. I don't know, it's hard to give advice, but maybe ploughing slightly shallower. There's certainly no need for deep ploughing for spring cereals, especially late in the season. That might help increase output.
The weather is still not playing ball, but there is a glimmer of hope for better weather next week. There are some hard choices around crop choice to be made in the coming weeks on many farms, but this is really dependent on farm circumstances and markets which are available to you. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. I'm delighted again to be joined by Shay Phelan and Ciaran Collins, both Tillage Specialists in Teagasc, to chat through the crop options for farmers and the associated risks with those choices. Shay, you might give us a quick update on where the spring plantings are to date.
Yeah, I suppose, Michael, nationally, if you take it on a national scale, it's very poor. There's very little planted all over the country. That said, if you take a kind of an area along the Barrow Valley here, that kind of malt and barley area, kind of a Thai Carlow sort of direction, there's a bit of spring barley sown in that area on the lighter land. But I suppose in an overall context, it's actually quite small. And I suppose for most of those farms, they've planted their lightest ground first. So they've planted all that spring barley, hoping to get malting quality in. But the heavier land, that the more clay type soils that they have, where they would have hoped to put in beans and oats and spring wheat, very little of that land is sown. So overall, I'd say if you're taking a national picture, probably 1 or 2 or 3%, something like that, sown nationally.
So Shay, for those crops that are planted in those farms, she's given all the wet weather that's there, what are those crops looking like at the moment?
For the most part, Michael, they're okay. They went into probably conditions that weren't ideal, but given that they're in and kind of light land, they're okay. People are probably happy enough that they did the work. That said, there's quite a bit of flood damage. There's a bit of crow damage in them. So they're all right. I suppose they're in the ground, they're growing.
So look, I suppose, as you're rightly saying, an awful lot of farmers listening to this will be thinking to themselves, geez, I'm not going to get out near my ground for another probably 10 days as a minimum. And they're probably rightly asking themselves, what crops do I plant now? Do I need to change what I originally had planned to go in there? We look at all those kind of major crops in turn, but first I just want to maybe just turn to maybe a few areas that maybe farmers, in your opinion, Shay, that farmers should consider in terms of the risks that are there in an overall sense.
Yeah, so you're right, Michael. I mean, if you take now planting cereals this time of year, barley's not, it's not late for barley. We'll start off there, so you're fine there. But for the likes of spring wheat, spring beans, and spring oats, you're now looking at crops that if they're going in now, you're looking at September harvest. And that's never ideal. If you have, and in a lot of cases, you don't mind a field or so, or maybe a day's harvesting in September. But if you're looking at a week's harvesting or maybe even a fortnight's harvesting in September, and don't forget, those harvest days in September are really short. You're talking at starting maybe just before lunchtime and finishing maybe at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evenings when the dew is starting to come down. So that's probably, to me, the big risk. I suppose the other risk that's there, even sowing crops at the moment, you're hoping that you get a Cinderella year from here on in, that there's no drought, there's no anything like that that's going to slow up the crop or slow the progress of the crop. And I suppose that's the other big risk that we've seen in similar seasons like this, where you have a late spring, that at some stage during the year, the rain stops for a period of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and crops that are poorly established or going into poor conditions, which a lot of them will do undoubtedly over the next couple of weeks, they dry out very, very quickly and they tend to yield very, very poorly afterwards. So to me, that's the big risk of sowing crops from here on in.
Okay. Yeah, so there is quite a lot of risks there, but I suppose a number of farmers have been talking to us, I suppose, and some of them who were pretty good as maybe they were trying to make sure they had everything ready to go when they need to have it ready to go, but they now have seed in the stores, spring wheat seed, spring oat seed, maybe spring bean seed still in the store. What do they do?
Yeah, it's a tough question, Mike. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, to be perfectly honest with you. if I take the spring wheat seed for example, I was talking to a grower just the other evening, and they have some of that spring wheat seed in, and it's foreign seed. So where do they go? There's nobody going to take that back. So he's looking at the scenario now that he doesn't really have a choice, but probably have to plant that. That's not ideal, not in any shape or form, but he really feels he's no choice. So, I mean, that's a tough call to make. Do you risk leaving that seed there until next year and leaving that land fallow, or maybe replace it with spring barley? That's provided spring barley seed available for him. So it's a really tough choice to make, especially if you're on rented ground. And that farmer I was talking to the other evening was adamant, well, not adamant, he was resigned to the fact that he was going to plant that spring wheat seed, albeit it's far from ideal.
Would I be right in saying, Ciaran, that once seed, I suppose, is on farms, that merchants aren't really taking it back?
No, and they're not. And again, you can't blame merchants because they have to find a home for that seed. If they take it back, they're at the loss of it. So in a lot of cases, like I say, some of this seed is brought in from other countries, so they've nowhere to bring it back to. So I suppose, and that's something that people have to remember, that that the seed houses and the merchants have gone to the well and gone across Europe and spent a lot of money getting this seed in, and they're at the loss of it, and lots of tons of it if it isn't planted.
But I suppose, Shay, that it's probably down to margin, I suppose, on a lot of these crops. I mean, it's
Absolutely,
the lesser
absolutely.
of one evil versus the other. And if somebody has beans on farm, it still might be a reasonable option. We'll come to that there in a second. Ciaran, I just wanted to bring you in for a second, and Shay mentioned spring wheat, and that's probably a very reasonable question. When is it time to stop sowing spring wheat?
Oh, sure. It's like, again, not to repeat what Shay said, but I mean, the seed situation is difficult. And we really, while we have our best estimates, we can't, there is an area reduction that we know that's coming, and how large that is going to, I suppose, determine whether we've enough seed or not, and there's seed and the spring wheat seed in the country. That was part of the equation of supplying enough seed for everybody. So that's the first thing. As Shay said, sowing spring wheat now is going to be a late harvest. Yield is going to be affected. Like, could you say you'd get 2.5 ton? If you get 2.5 ton, that's a break-even yield. Now, I suppose, look, if you're forced into it, I think whole cropping that is probably an option. And, on the livestock side, there's a forage scarcity and there will be demand for silage on that. So maybe lining up a client for it, that might be a good way of doing it, getting that out off the field a little bit earlier. So that's about as good an answer as I can give in it, really. It is like, in a normal year, you wouldn't sow spring wheat now, I suppose. That's really it.
And is it the same story, Ciaran, with beans?
Beans is complicated. Yes, is the answer from an agronomy and yield perspective. Sowing beans now is technically too late. However, we have a protein payment, which could be anything between, I don't know, 4 and 500 euro, depending on the area that's sown. It's the high end of that at the moment, obviously, because there's very little in the ground. So that distorts the figure. I suppose if you go back to 2018 was the last year that we had really late beans, and then we got hit with a drought, and a lot of crops didn't do a ton, well, say a ton to the acre of an average, I think was the national yield. Again, we don't know what the weather will bring after, but certainly if it's a normal year, it'll be a late harvest. However, when you look at the margins again, a ton even still leaves you with a positive margin purely because of the protein payment. If you get a ton and a quarter, ton and a half, you're gaining a little bit. And there is, I suppose, another complicated factor. There's contract prices of 250 euros a ton for beans, which is very, very strong in terms of where feed barley is at the moment. So look, I suppose from a yield perspective, in summary, you wouldn't be sowing them. However, the protein payment is still an incentive. However, if I had beans in my shed and I'm going to sow them, they're the very, very first thing I have to sow when the weather turns.
Shay, I just want to come to you there just in terms of oats. You might just chat through the risks and why somebody might still consider oats.
Yeah, and I suppose, like Ciaran was saying, Michael, there's kind of a nuance to this as well, in terms of there are very little winter oats planted in the country so far, and oats are one of those crops whereby quite a bit of it now is contracted to different groups and merchants and whatever. So those people are still going to look for those contracts to be filled at whatever the price might be, albeit that's now going to be late and yields are going to be lower. And like Ciaran is saying there, I mean, 2.5 tons is kind of, you're looking at kind of break even sort of stuff if you're around there on oats as well, similar to other crops as well. Again, I suppose the risk for those contracts is that you're going to be harvesting in late in September. And will they make that quality when there's quality issues, needed? So that's the big gamble, I suppose, that you have with that. The other, I suppose, issue that a lot of people have done last year with oats, which kind of does help the margin a little bit, is to put it in for the straw chopping scheme or straw incorporation measure, if you like, and that does help in terms of that's €250 a hectare that's guaranteed on those crops. So that's certainly something that probably pushes you slightly in the favor of staying going with those crops, especially where contract prices are available or contracts are available at those higher premiums. So I suppose feed oats, it really is kind of, it's coming up against the last days now, I suppose, of continuing with those crops, or those contract oats, whether it be storum, whether it be gluten-free, or whether it be human oats, human for porridge or whatever. Those contracts are probably valuable, so people will be encouraged to try and sow away for another couple of weeks yet.
Spring barley, Shay, or it would always be looked upon as, I suppose, the default crop. But I suppose there's certainly there's a good bit of ground out there that's still very wet and probably won't be sown until probably very late April. Does that still have a chance of doing okay?
Tough question, Michael. Yes and no. I suppose if you're in kind ground and ground that's, almost ready to go, it's probably fine. But I suppose my experience over the last couple of years, especially in the northeast, which is kind of really wheat ground, that land takes a lot of time to dry out. And when it does start to dry out, it dries out very, very quickly. So that heavy clay soils, they dry out very, very, very quickly. And when they do start to dry out, the seed beds become very lumpy and very open. And I suppose those type of seed beds, to me, pose the highest risk for spring barley still, that they don't perform terribly well in those soils. And I suppose experience over the last number of years, we've had seasons like this in those areas, those spring barley crops have been pretty poor, to be brutally honest with you. Last year, I think some of the crops did little over a ton an acre. So that's not a profitable crop. So I suppose the other point about that too is that some farms and some fields, they're not all wet. So there might be areas within fields that are wet, say maybe headlands near a river or something like that. Don't wait for those to dry out. Work around those areas if you have to. Maybe make a second headland or something like that, and try and drill what's ready to drill, and not wait for those wet areas. Those wet areas could take a month to dry out. Now at this stage they're that wet. So I suppose it's assessing your fields, seeing are they suitable for spring barley, seeing what areas within those fields are suitable for spring barley, and try and get in as early as you possibly can on those fields. And that's probably going to give you the best chance to make a profitable crop, although it might not be the whole field is planted. You might have to leave a section of the field not planted.
Okay. Ciaran, I know we talked about all these crops before, and there's probably a few other crops that we haven't mentioned so far. In terms of the overall, I suppose, farmers would always maintain that if you can drive yield, it'll drive margins. But is this year slightly different?
Yeah, sure. Look, I suppose we have a grain price at the moment. We're doing margins there at the moment. We've barley in there at 180, wheat at 190, and oats, depending whether it's a contract or not. There's oats contracts worth more than barley, I suppose. So look, that's obviously the number one factor, and then you have to get yield to cover your costs based on those prices. So like, if you look at barley, and Shay said it already, I mean, if barley is sown between now and say the 20th, 25th of April, I mean, it still stands, that's feed barley, a reasonably good chance of getting a good yield and giving the grower a positive margin. So, and spring barley will obviously be the biggest crop by a mile that's sown, possibly 140,000 hectares this year. So, that's where it is. I think the difficulty is and there's a lot of growers with a lot of ground to cover. So some of this barley and other crops will be sown at the back end of the month and facing into May. So like, if you look at say spring feed barley, to stick with that one towards the end of the month, you're sort of looking at getting maybe somewhere between 2.25, 2.5 ton to give you a positive margin, So this is where it starts to get a bit trickier, because it's getting more challenging to get that yield at that stage, depending on your conditions. And then May barley, as we know, look, that's really, really hard to leave a positive margin there, because it's just getting really late, and you're really dependent on the weather conditions that follow to help you in a big way. So I suppose really look, yeah, Michael, the earlier that they can be sown, spring barley, just to use that example, feed barley can leave a positive margin, certainly. Same with malting barley, obviously, that's going to be the priority for any grower. It's a contract price, it's a good price, it could be 50, 60 euros above feed, potentially. And then, obviously getting that in first, just from keeping the protein down perspective, would be the priority there.
And of course, we haven't really mentioned too much about, the necessity to make sure you claim all the, if there's a strong corporation scheme there, if there's protein payment scheme there, and maybe you might just have a quick word before we go past the margins. Is there anything worth looking at there for the forage crop scenario, the beets or the maises, maybe?
There is, and I suppose just to mention, I know I spoke about the protein aid already, but like, don't forget SIM as well. And I suppose there's a lot of talk out there, straw is scarce, and it's valuable, and that certainly is, and it's something that we'll go after. However, like, if you have some really late crops, that might only give you 5 bales an acre, well, do the sums for yourself on your own farm, because you might be better off with SIM in that case. But I think the crucial thing around straw is to try and assess, the demand in your area, see what kind of price it's going to be, and then weigh up the options with SIM. But I think sowing day, it's going to be a big factor there. We all know that you'll get good yields, good yields of grain, good yields of straw, but that's going to come from the first crops that are sown. But if you have a lot of barley to sow and you're going out very late in the season, you can't count on getting a lot of straw for that. So look, maybe the SIM is an option there. The second part of the question, Michael, forage crops, yeah, certainly going to be an option. Obviously in the livestock sector, there's big challenges there with silage. Silage is, a lot of people are looking at a back wall of a silage pit now, so there's going to be demand for that. Again, it depends the area that you're in. If your land is suitable to grow maize or beet, if you have the equipment to do it, but it is certainly worth looking at. However, the biggest word of caution there is you have to get a commitment from the grower at the other side. And that commitment to me is getting a deposit before the crop is sown, because then, there's plenty of very, very good relationships out there for tillage farmers growing maize and beet, for livestock farmers, and they're working brilliantly. But, if you it's a big expense now growing either of those crops. So I think having a forage contract is vital, really. I think what works really well for people are stage payments, where, say, just for example, a third of the payment just before the crop is sown, maybe a third of the payment mid-season, and the final third of the payment then when it's delivered in the end. And I think that can, there's security there then that you have a market for it. And there's also security for the farmer buying it, because they know that it's going to be delivered upon,
Sure, and we have a template there that's ready to be downloaded and filled in by anybody who needs to use it. The other one, Ciaran, that just strikes me, I suppose, is that obviously we're in very much a plough-based system, and a wet year like this probably, or maybe does it, suit more of a plough-based system. But it strikes me there are probably going to be some bottlenecks. Ploughing is kind of slow, a lot of ground to get over. How do you think that's going to fare out this year?
Yeah, to me, that's going to be the biggest challenge again for growers and contractors with a big area to cover, that there's very little ploughing done already, and maybe what ploughing mightn't be any great advantage if it dries too quickly. So ploughing is going to be the slow end of that process. There's nothing you can do other than to have everything ready and ready to go. But it certainly is going to be a bottleneck, especially at the start in getting things moving. I don't know, it's hard to give advice, but maybe ploughing slightly shallower. There's certainly no need for deep ploughing for spring cereals, especially late in the season. That might help increase output. Just all the basics of having all your spares and parts and stuff ready. Labor is going to be a challenge as well. I think some people have mentioned that while equipment might be there, you just a lot of one-man operations and relying on a bit of help, so that's certainly going to be a challenge. But lining up things as best you can. I think also there is a bit of min-till equipment in the country, a bit more than there was, and I suppose certainly in relation to catch crops. Now, while at the start when ground is wet, it wouldn't certainly be suitable for that type of equipment, but that might be something when ground starts to dry out that it might help to speed up the process if there is some of that equipment available on a farm, and to maybe just run it a little bit deeper than you normally would, and that might help speed up the process a little bit as well.
And Shay, just in that regard, I just know a couple of questions here. Maybe I might ask you both of them. One around seeding rates. Is it as simple as the later you go, the more you should increase your seeding rates well, maybe just concentrate in spring barley first of all?
Yeah, I suppose you have to look at where we are in the season now, Michael, and we take it there's not going to be nothing else planted this week, so we're talking somewhere maybe the 15th, 20th of April before people really get moving if the weather is to be believed as where we are at the moment. So your season is starting to get short. So even though establishment rates generally increase with warmer conditions, your capacity for the crop to actually form tillers, if you're thinking spring barley, starts to reduce. And we know from trying to work here in Oak Park and other sites that, if you don't have those tiller numbers, if you don't have heads per square meter, your chance of getting a good yield are greatly diminished. So we need to try and get a target of, that 1,000 shoots, if you like, a square meter come harvest time. And we're only going to get that by getting enough plants in the ground. We're not going to get 3 or 4 tillers per plant if you're going to plant in late April. So we need to start increasing seed rates to take account of that. So normally, I suppose, if you're looking at, depending on your 1,000 grain weight, normally people probably saw somewhere around 11 stone, maybe at the beginning of the month. Once you start getting towards the end of the month, you're talking maybe 200 kilos a hectare, depending on the 1,000 grain weight, which is about 12 and a half stone an acre in all money. So I suppose just to put it in context, that's the reason why we need to increase seed rates. The other thing too is, I suppose, and it's something that I'm conscious of around some of the lighter land or land that tends to dry out, is that we need to cover ground as quickly as we possibly can to try and keep as much moisture in the ground as we possibly can. And the more plants we have there, the more likely that'll happen. We've seen last year whereby, people saw plants or saw spring barley particularly, maybe one tiller on it, and the ground is, in June is open and dries out very, very quickly when you get those long dry days in June. So that's the reason why I suppose we're trying to encourage people to sow more seed at the beginning or at the end of April now.
Yeah. And what about nutrients, Shay? Should the nutrients be applied to that crop in the seed bed, or pretty much all of it, or some of it, or what's the...
Yeah, I
what's the
suppose
best way to
you're
go?
right, Michael. I suppose in olden days we would have been using combine drills, so you've been putting 3 or 4 bags of a compound down the spout with the seed, and I suppose that's still good practice. And certainly, whether you put all of it in, all the nitrogen in or not, I hear people starting to switch to 18-6-12, maybe going 3 or 4 bags of 18-6-12, which is putting 50, 60 units or 80 kilos of nitrogen in the seed bed. I suppose that's probably where a lot of people are going to go, and maybe top it up then with something like 20-0-15 or something like that if you need a bit of potash. So I think, we're going to have to probably look at maybe putting at least probably 50% of the nitrogen in the seed bed. And trying to drive the crop on as quickly as you possibly can. I suppose the other risk that people are always conscious of in a year like this is where you do top dress, especially spring barley, and you get a dry week or fortnight, that sometimes that nitrogen is left on top of the soil and not accessible to the whether it be spring barley, spring wheat, or spring oats. So I suppose that's a fear that's there. So the more that you have in the seed bed, be it that 50% or 60% of the total, I suppose that's probably where a lot of people will go at this stage.
Shay and Ciaran, huge thanks again to you for for going through all of that. There's no easy decisions in any of this as far as I can see. But look, I suppose the link to anybody is that there's There's plenty of help available out there for farmers, whether it's your own local advisor, whether it's a Teagasc advisor or somebody else. And there's also a Tillage Helpline there available for everyone as well. So listen, guys, thanks very much for your input again, and we might be chatting to you again shortly.
Thanks, Michael.
So my thanks to Shay and Ciaran for joining me on the show, and we'll have them back shortly to talk through more crop issues. There's a Tillage Helpline open at the moment on 059 91 83 533. If you are finding it very difficult at the moment to figure out what to do in the coming weeks, please don't hesitate to ring the helpline to get some expert advice, and we'll try and help you the best we can. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.